Yeah, we'll do less than that. We're competing with Christian Prince. He's live now too, so that'll cut down on the viewers some for sure. Not really sure what to expect for the first time. Hey, everybody in the live chat, let us know where you are if you don't mind. Be interesting to see. I like looking at YouTube demographics. Oh, hell, there's Syed. Welcome, Syed. Everybody in the live chat, let us know if you can hear and see us. Canada. Yeah, looks like everybody can hear us. So we can shoot the breeze just for a couple of minutes, have some fun while we're waiting for people to click in to log in. I have some time constraints. I'm moving, so that's fun. All the money that Muslims talk about, it's true. I actually bought my own island and my own, built my own private mansion. So it's 99,000 square feet. And I had that number chosen specifically. So, yeah, I'm moving to my own private island. So if you want to come visit me, that would be great. I don't know if you're into that kind of thing or not, but.
Sounds like a good idea.
The only problem is, Surah 68, right? Where the earth is on the whale's back. Are you familiar with that from Ibn Abbas?
Yeah, the random letter that he decided is a whale.
Right. Yeah. So you have the earth on the back of the whale, and then that's on a bull, and that's on a rock, and that's on dust, and no one knows what's under the dust except Allah. So I actually found my island is the one that's on the back of that whale. So it may be a little difficult to come visit me because the island moves, So don't come visit me during migration season because my whale will be all over the place. So yeah, moving. And that part is legit. And then we have Bible study tonight. I forgot about that. So it's deal with some realtors, jump in for this live stream, and then go off to Bible study. So a busy night for sure. Sounds like you have a cat in the background.
Yeah, got a couple cats.
Is your cat in pain?
Nope. I just fed her, so she's not hungry. But
okay.
But she likes to meow right after being fed.
So Yaya's from the UK. That's cool. We tried to time this early enough so people in the UK who I think are 5 hours ahead could watch. So we do have some UK viewers. That's cool. Stickman Sam, yes, I am paid by the Jews. That's right. Wow. So the question is, do I take a month off from the channel, 6 weeks off from the channel, move, get situated, that kind of thing? Or do I try to just slow down the production and try to multitask? So that's the question. I don't know what I'll do with that, but some things are going to have to change at least for the next 6 weeks or so. Though Abraham is ready to be edited. That's rough cut. Looking forward to that one, but it's quite a challenge. So
yeah, I'm looking forward to that one.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. You have a favorite hadith or favorite verse from the Quran, just out of curiosity?
So I like the absurd stuff. So probably my favorite Quran verse is the story where there's a guy who's killed and they don't know who did it. So Muhammad's like, you got to kill a cow. And they're like, oh, what kind of cow? And he's like, oh, find a yellow one. And then they kill the cow, and then he takes a piece from the cow and he slaps it against the dead guy, and he comes back to life and tells him who killed him. So that's my favorite.
It's a great one. What about, so I think hadith you might have mentioned before, the monkey stoning hadith also. That's a good one.
Yeah, I find that one pretty funny. For the hadith, I think it's a toss-up. You got the monkeys who found a monkey committing adultery apparently and decided to stone them. And then a random guy comes along and he's like, oh yeah, this looks like fun. I'll join in. I'll start killing the monkeys too.
Yeah.
But of course there's also the classic Moses being naked and the rock runs away with his clothes so that it can be revealed to not have any blemishes on his body. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
That's pretty funny.
Turns out he was pretty good looking. Yeah. During the period of Pre-Islamic ignorance. I saw a she monkey surrounded by a number of monkeys. Yeah, and they were stoning it. That's really incredible. It's funny. I always read when the pre-Islamic period of ignorance. What do you call the period of Islam if the pre-Islamic period is ignorant? It's quite an interesting designation.
Well, even the Quran can't decide when Islam began, because you got the one verse that says Muhammad's the first Muslim, and you got another that says Abraham's the first Muslim.
Yeah.
And then you got Adam's the first Muslim. I mean, make up your mind.
Yeah, on this day, your religion's been perfected, and surahs continue to be revealed after that. Absolutely. And so then, yeah, with respect to the Muslim thing, Islamic scholars have had to claim, well, there's small m Muslims. They submitted to God prior to the Islamic period. And so that's what the Quran means, always having to try to correct the word of Allah. Yeah. Tom Burnett, I see him around a lot. That's cool. What's up? Tippy Bear, multitasking apparently with CP streaming here at the same time. So that's cool. Awesome. Let me run this by you. You responded to this comment, and let me just run this by you again to get a real-time response, because this person in their comment on my channel said, I was asked by the speaker of this video, which is me, to show him where in the Quran does it say Muhammad was a truthful person. That wasn't actually what I originally asked. It was show me where Muhammad is a prophet in the Quran. And they say, I prove this with a reference. Okay, now here's what I want you to respond to, in capital letters, of course. But wait a minute, what does the Bible say about Muhammad? John 16:13. But when he, the Spirit of truth, comes, he will guide you into all truth, for he will not speak on his own initiative, etc. Did you ever think that you would respond to something like that before you saw these YouTube channels on Islam?
No, definitely not. I had no idea that the Gospel of John was part of the Quran. I mean, you asked him for a Quran reference, and he tells you to look at John. So
it's incredible how much more comfortable Muslims are dealing with the Bible, or at least attempting to deal with the Bible, than with the Quran. It's absolutely stunning. Yeah, awesome. Well, we're at 55, so that's actually more than I thought. I was going to say 50 will be our threshold for getting started, so we can go ahead and get into this. I'll give a bit of a more formal introduction. Just want to say thanks to everyone for viewing and for participating in the live chat. There are people who I see regularly in the comments section, and whenever I see them, I breathe a sigh of relief, because I know through past experience that they're going to give good answers, perhaps even reasoned answers. And so that works for everyone, because it saves me time. Imagine producing a video and uploading it and all that, and then responding to comments. And the person raising the objection or the question gets a good answer. And so they're participating as well. Works for everyone. Everyone is happy. And certainly one of those people who I've come to appreciate in the comments section over the last couple months has been this strange guy who goes by the code name of Reasoned Answers. And he's here with us for a short live chat this evening. As I mentioned, we do have some time constraints, but welcome, Reasoned. I hope that introduction was sufficient, and we'll just start by asking, what do you want to go by? Reasoned Answers, or what do you want us to call you?
Well, thanks for having me on. You can call me Thaddeus. That's my first name, so that works well.
That's kind of just one of those really smart sounding names. You don't need anything in front of that, you know, PhD, doctor. You don't need that. It's like Thaddeus. I mean, I feel a little bit intimidated talking to you after knowing that's your first name, but we'll just try to wing it anyway. We'll start. I want to find out a little bit about you, and I've extended this invitation to a couple of other people on the comments section as well. Syed is one of them, and he's actually in the comments section. See if he's still there somewhere. And it certainly wasn't going to be anything confrontational, just kind of a meet and greet. And the purpose of this is so people get to know you and him, if he would have agreed, and just to promote more civil dialogue, really. So that's what it's all about. So tell us about yourself. We'll start with why are you a Christian?
Oh, excellent question. I like to answer that question by starting off by saying I'm a Christian because Christianity is true. And by true, I don't mean I feel it's true. I mean that there's really good, solid evidence that it's true. You know, most religions, you kind of just have to take it or leave it. they don't really make any statements that can be tested. But Christianity is based on a historical event. If you can disprove the resurrection of Jesus, then Christianity disappears. So that's kind of the reason why I'm a Christian. I'll also go into a little bit of how I became a Christian. So I grew up in a Christian household, and I had religious education classes and such. So I would have always called myself a Christian. But really all I got out of those classes is, do these moral things, and you'll be fine kind of deal. Not that that's necessarily what they taught. That's just kind of what I got out of it. So as a teenager, a friend of mine invited me to a Bible study. I went along, and at the start of the study, it probably wasn't the first time I went, but one of the studies, they had a kind of a mini altar call where they had everyone put down their heads, and they said, has everyone here accepted Jesus as their personal savior? And I'd never heard that particular terminology before, so I didn't raise my hand. And then there's that anyone who didn't raise their hand, would you want to? And I raised my hand, and then they took me through a little prayer, and then they took me away from the group to have, give a introduction to Christianity type thing. And, they were giving me these, they were kind of going through the Roman road tract, if you will, saying everyone's a sinner and this is why you need God and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, that's all great. I just want to get out and shout about this incredible sensation that's come over me, So that's kind of how I became a Christian. That was about 20 years ago. I don't remember exactly how I got into apologetics, but I know very early on, I had a Bible already, but I never really studied it any substantial amount. Just right away, I decided that I really wanted to do that. It's not anything anyone told me. It's just, I would say obviously that it's the Holy Spirit leading me to want to study God's Word. In my studies, somehow I came across apologetics. I believe that William Lane Craig's first edition of Reasonable Faith was the first thing I was introduced to, which is a pretty high-level introduction if you're familiar with Craig's work. I loved it. And since then, I've just continued to study, gotten into all kinds of things.
You mentioned getting into apologetics. What sort of apologetics have you been involved in, and for how long?
So when I first started, when I first became a Christian, I was particularly interested in the evolution question. At that time, I was very much a believer in evolution. My friend was not, so we would have discussions about that. And from there, I started to discover all the evidence about the creation of life, how amazingly improbable it would be for even the simplest cell to come about through natural processes. So that's what I was looking at early on. But then, like I said, I got into William Lane Craig, and his main focus is on the historical argument for the resurrection. So that was probably my main focus over the years, just because that was really interesting to me.
Yeah. It's been the same with me with respect to the evolution creation debate. And I find this is true with several Christians that I've talked to. They become interested from sort of the evolution angle, but then once they get into Genesis 1 and 2 and studying it in the biblical context, in the historical context, all of the evolution talk and the science talk just goes out the window. You find that it really has no place in specifically Genesis 1 and 2. And it seems like in your description, you kind of started in that same place from the evolutionary scientific perspective, and then moved beyond that into the biblical theological worldview, and then from there into other things. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty safe thing to say. I no longer have any care about how old the world is. It's not an important question. It's not a theologically significant question, so I don't really worry about that. But getting into something like the resurrection, now that's a really important issue. That's something
Yeah.
I really want to study, really want to know well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's yeah, it's the same way with me. I couldn't care less about the age of the earth. I couldn't care less about, you know, the flat earth arguments and that sort of thing. For me, it's the theology of it. The Bible is thoroughly a theological book. And so that's, I find very important to look for the theology that's there, and to stay away from the stuff that's less relevant. I find we're very much alike in many ways, especially as we've been talking over the last couple of weeks. You mentioned studying the Bible, and you had a sort of a renewed interest in biblical studies. And just give me your reflections on this. I think that a lot of Christians aren't aware of the depth of the biblical text. And then once they are, if they can be made aware of that somehow, then the interest naturally follows, the interest in in-depth biblical studies. What do you think about that? Just generally, Christians that you run into, kind of a superficial understanding of the Bible, and because of that, maybe their study life isn't quite what it should be?
I would say that's definitely true. You know, most people have this impression, and by most people, I mean most Christians have this impression that, you know, you kind of just have to believe. There's no evidence one way or another. It's kind of, you just take it or leave it. I know that's, of course, atheists really love to play into that stereotype. And I mean, in fairness, it is true of a lot of Christians that they really just don't know anything. But once you start to look carefully at the word, you know, you can read the same passage 20 times and see 20 different things. And then you look at a commentary and they see things you have never seen. And it
Absolutely.
just goes on and on.
I'm going through David Allen's commentary right now, the New American Commentary series in Hebrews, and I feel like I've never read the book before. I feel like I've never read the book of Hebrews. His commentary is so insightful, and biblical studies keeps me extremely humble. If you were to ask me how much do I know about the Bible, I would say very, very little. It's a very humbling field when you talk about linguistics, history, context. It's a vast amount of material, and definitely keeps you humble. You mentioned Dr. Craig's material. Did you interface much with his dissertation? I think that he wrote his THD dissertation on the resurrection. Did you interface much with that, or mostly from the philosophical aspect of it? And then from there, could you kind of guide us into, I know you've done a lot of work on the Gospels. Did you kind of proceed from an interest in the resurrection to the Gospels, the things that you've posted on various social media platforms and so forth?
Yeah, so you know, I early on I got really into the resurrection through Craig, mostly through his popular level works at that point, and then I discovered a site called ChristianThinkTank.com, and he just goes into, like, he addresses the really hard questions, you know, the kind of things that atheists like to point out. You know, the Old Testament violence, you know, taking a look at a contradiction that seems completely unresolvable, and then he goes into great detail about that. So then that's kind of how I started jumping around. And then, you know, off and on, I would get more into it, less into it as other things in life came up. But the last couple years, I've been listening. I started listening to a bunch of different sermons and such online. Got back into doing the apologetics type work. I started listening to Ravi Zacharias all the time. And then I was just watching, or I was just looking at the comments on one of his videos, and someone was like, you know, Ravi is the best, and the second best is Acts 17 Apologetics. And I was like, okay, I got to check out that channel and and see what they have.
That's a very interesting contrast. In lining up the first and second place, they completely switch genres. I can't imagine Ravi participating in an Islamicize Me series, for example.
No, I mean, Ravi's very non-confrontational. You know, he actually catches a lot of flack for talking to people with different perspectives. And, you know, he says, yeah, I have to agree not to be very explicit in the talk, but I know in the Q&A, I'll get the gospel in. And that's all that really matters.
Huh. Very interesting. Yeah. Another interesting thing, and I call it a tension between biblical studies, and I mean legitimate biblical studies versus apologetics, is that there's a tension in the sense that with apologetics, it can make you wonder sometimes or wish sometimes that things were just more simple, that certain theological principles, doctrines, that certain textual issues were just more simple and straightforward, easier to communicate. But from a biblical studies perspective, people like you and I, and many people on the channel as well, especially that follow the Biblical Insight series, love digging into the in-depth content. But it's, I think, difficult to balance these two things and to resolve this tension sometimes. Have you experienced that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's difficult because I love getting really in depth, and then I try to talk to someone, and they're like, "You're just boring me to death here." I'm trying to go through all the detailed evidence, and they're like, "Yeah, I'm bored. Just give me the 2-sentence version."
Yeah, it's funny. I was having a conversation with an older lady at church a couple of weeks ago, and thinking about this, and a lot of reasons that I produced the Biblical Insight series is things that I've come across, in my own studies. You can't just walk up to somebody and say, "Let me tell you about this ancient hymn in Amos and all of these participles." They'll look at you like, "What are you talking about?" But if you go through the trouble of just digging into this material and producing content and putting it out there, people will find it and they will appreciate it. So I think there's room for both. Of course, I try to do both the apologetics and the more in-depth stuff. I'm better at the in-depth stuff and not as adept at sort of the quick soundbite answers. But it's definitely a tension there, and it's difficult to balance. The other thing is the time issue, because I don't know about you, but for me, the things that I have to study for apologetics are completely different from the things that I want to study out of my own personal interest. So I wouldn't interface with a lot of arguments or a lot of text in the way that I would as an apologist versus someone who's a biblical student. I wouldn't waste time refuting Muhammad in Song of Solomon 15 or Deuteronomy 18 or something like that. Think about all the time put into those types of videos and those types of presentations when you could actually be doing some legitimate biblical studies. So there's certainly some tension there that we need to work out.
Yeah, absolutely. The things that I tend to like to read are, like an academic commentary, for example. I mean, that has very little chance of me being able to talk to someone about it. I try to give a simple argument for the resurrection, and they're like, "Yeah, you just believe that because the Bible tells you." And it's like, no, I'm trying to show you that using normal historical methods, it's a perfectly reasonable conclusion. You don't have to assume the Bible's inspired to draw the conclusions. And I'm like, but to actually give you a really good argument, you got to go into a lot of detail, and you don't want to hear a lot of detail. So that's all you're going to hear is that, oh, you believe the Bible because you believe the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's important to articulate our reasons for believing, for sure. Let's bring this around to Islam just a bit. You mentioned Ravi. I'm assuming that's kind of your inroad to Islamic studies, and of course, David Wood along with Ravi. Can you kind of outline for us maybe when you started getting into the field of Islamic apologetics, polemics, and so forth?
Yep, it was definitely 100% David Wood. I went to his channel. I'm pretty sure I watched his testimonial video first, which of course has nothing to do with Islam, but it's a really amazing story and a really impactful video. Probably most of your, if not all of your subscribers have checked it out before, but if they haven't, they definitely should. So anyway, I watched that. And I was like, I got to watch more content by this guy. And of course, I just looked at some of his all-time most popular videos, and of course they're all on Islam. So that's kind of just how I got started. I started watching his videos, and I was like, Islam's the one other religion other than Christianity that really you can apply historical methods to. And David's right. There's pretty much no one out there who's trying to speak to Muslims. So this would be a good area to get into, and that's just kind of how I got started in it.
Yeah. So what studying have you done? I notice you mentioned, or I remember you mentioned to me the curious story of Joseph the other day in a text message. What do your Islamic studies consist of?
Well, I've tried to read through the Quran a couple times. It's not very fun to read. I don't mean because it contains so many horrible stories or so much terrible morals. I mean, it's just really boring, really terrible to read. You'll read 3 verses and then the subject will change for no apparent reason. It's just all randomly put together. And then, you read a couple more chapters and then the same story comes up again. And it's like, didn't you already talk about this once? So I've tried to read through that. I've watched thousands and thousands of hours of well, that might be a bit of exaggeration, but hundreds for sure, probably 1,000 hours of videos by David, yourself, other anti-Islamic channels, and then I try to think which of these arguments are really good arguments and which are kind of just silly, and I try to stick to the good ones. I don't see a lot of point in just making fun of someone. Like the story I brought up in the beginning about the silly cow story. I mean, yeah, I can make fun of that story, but it's not really a good argument against Islam. So I try to stick to the more logical type arguments.
Yeah, it's interesting when you mention that story as well as the one where the rock grabs Moses' clothes and runs off with them. The thing that's always been in the back of my mind is, where did this come from? And it's interesting to go into these prior Jewish and Christian legends and figure that out. So for me, that's the way. Yeah, the stories are funny, as you say, but funny isn't really an objection. It's interesting to dig kind of back in the pre-Islamic times and dig that stuff up a little bit and show Muslims that this is where your sources come from. It's interesting you mentioned, David Wood. I've seen some of his videos, years ago when I first started interfacing with Islam some, and I went through this process of hearing something on his channel, and this is before I knew about Sunnah.com, if it was even up, I'm not sure. But I would hear something on his channel, some hadith, for example, and I would say, that's impossible. It can't say that. So I bought Sahih al-Bukhari by Dar al-Salam, Dr. Muhammad Khan, and I looked up all of these references, and every single one of them said exactly what David said they did. And I bought the Sirah, and certainly Sharia law couldn't be that repulsive. And so I bought al-Mizri's work, and on it goes, buying these sources because I just didn't believe that they actually said what the critics said they said. And now I'm fully convinced and have very little doubt when we hear these types of things that that's exactly what the Islamic sources said. I believe that translating the hadith into English was one of the biggest mistakes that Islamic scholars have ever made. Islam has come under a lot of criticism since then. But eventually, you went from just hearing about Islam through Ravi Zacharias and David Wood to studying it a bit for yourself and getting more and more immersed in the wild world of YouTube comments. So how did that work out for you?
Yeah, so I probably started contributing to comments a little before I discovered your channel, but it was definitely your channel that I really started to get into the comments. I would always read the comments, but I would never respond because so many of them are just so stupid. I don't mean they have bad arguments. I mean, they're just pointless comments. But then for whatever reason, your channel has a lot of back and forth, and that's not really normal for YouTube comments. So I started really getting into it on your channel.
Yeah, it's interesting. I looked the other day, just kind of a survey of some of the much more popular channels. Obviously, I'm only at 8K subscribers, but the comment to view ratio on my channel, about 30%, comments per the number of views, which is extremely high. Most channels are 2, 3, 4%. So for some reason, yeah, people are super talkative. But the last several months, for sure, I've seen your name over and over in the comments, and something. I mean, you have held on in comment threads where I long would have just thrown in the towel. There's no hope of any sort of a coherent conversation being maintained, and so I'm out of here. I'll spend my time on something else. And there's Thaddeus, just responding to all of these objections. You have some tenacity, you have some patience, so commend you for that. What's driving you to do that?
I don't know. I think it's just my personality that if someone responds, no matter how bad the argument is, I feel like I need to follow up. I can't let them have not that I can't let them have the last word, but I can't let their silly objection go unanswered.
Yeah, it's kind of that thought of, what if someone comes along and sees this is the last comment and I didn't respond? I guess I've gotten over that since then. So how did you get to the channel specifically? Was it just a related video or what?
Yeah, I believe it was probably the hijab debate video and one of your responses to it. About the time I discovered it, you're just starting the Biblical Insight series, and that's what really hooked me. It was the Biblical Insight series. I know it's not quite as popular as your Islamic content, but for me, it was the big hook.
Awesome.
Because I don't really know anyone else that's doing anything like that.
Well, except for you coming up. We'll talk more about that. What do you think are some of the more powerful arguments against Islamic ideology? If you were just to run into a couple of Muslims on the street and start a conversation, where would you want to steer that as far as raising some serious objections to their ideology?
So I think that maybe the easiest argument to use in a conversation, at least, is what David calls the Islamic dilemma, that the Quran makes it quite clear that the script, the gospel, and the Torah are preserved and inspired and authoritative for Christians in Muhammad's day. But then modern Muslims say, oh no, it's been corrupted. So, you can defeat that argument. Not that they will necessarily accept it, but you got a good argument against it. You say, I'm just saying the Quran says that the gospel's not corrupted. And if you look in Islamic history, it was many hundred years before anyone came up with the idea that the gospel or the Torah was corrupted. They all thought that exactly what the Quran says, that the only reason Muhammad got a revelation is because there was no Arab language, no Arabic language revelation yet. And that was the same revelation that previous people had received. But, when you look, they're clearly not. So, that sort of dilemma is, it's not that threatening. It's not like, calling your prophet immoral. I think that's a good argument. It's shuts down conversation real quick.
Yeah, if you're just going to meet someone on the street, that it's a bit of an abrasive way to start the conversation. I brought a face-to-face example, Surah 5:43-48, up to a Muslim one time, and about the Quran. The Jews look for the Torah, Christians look to the gospel, etc. And the response was utter just denial. It's context. Well, and then I said, well, what's the context? Explain the context. It's context. And the last resort was for him to queue up Surah 5, because they don't read the Quran. Many times the Muslims I've talked to, when they say read the Quran, they actually mean listen to the Quran. So he queued up Surah 5 on his phone and just listened to it. And as if the answer was going to come to him from Jibril or something of that sort. And it was just listen to the whole surah and you'll find your answer. That was the response. It was just he had never seen these verses before, and I didn't even go further into 1094, 7157 or anything like that. It was just those short couple of verses in Surah 5, and that was enough to just absolutely destroy this person emotionally for 10 or 15 minutes as they listened to the recitation of this surah and just had no explanation for it. So the not very well versed in their own book, as small as it is. I think many Muslims find it as difficult to read as you do. I guess I tend towards the more esoteric content for sure. I think I don't know what you think of them, but I think the arguments against Muhammad as a mystic and as one who practiced divination are extremely serious, especially when you compare that to the Torah, which Muhammad is supposed to confirm. And it turns out, Sahih al-Bukhari book 1 might as well say Muhammad practiced divination. It's that obvious. It's that explicit when you know the background. So that's why I've been hanging out in the area of Merkabah mysticism for the last couple of months on the channel. But to me, those are really interesting and I think really powerful arguments. And it's clear that Muslims haven't heard this very much. I mean, have you seen a difference in the comment section versus Muhammad in the Song of Solomon or Deuteronomy? I have a couple of videos on those topics, or the debate with hijab that you mentioned, versus these videos on mysticism. Muslims just really don't have any idea how to respond at all.
Yeah, definitely. As absurd as the Song of Solomon argument is, they've heard it so much that they have lots of material to go back on. They don't necessarily answer your points, but they at least make another reply. But on the source criticism in general and on the mysticism, that's not something they've heard. So they have no clue how to respond other than the default of, well, the Bible says this, explain it to me.
Absolutely. And the other one I've gotten a couple times by different people is that I am deceiving the deceived or leading astray those who have been led astray, or something of that sort. I'm not sure really what they're angling for on that. Let's move this conversation to your channel. Recently, you started producing some videos, or decided to produce some videos, and you have one under your belt so far on suffering. Talk to us a little bit about why that was your first video, and also talk to us on the more humorous side of things about the implicit irony of producing a YouTube video on suffering, because personally I consider the editing and production and reviewing of YouTube videos to be a form of suffering itself. So walk us through what led you to your first video.
Yeah, so completely unrelated to thinking about anything on YouTube, I joined the evangelism committee at my church. And, we were talking about ways to try to outreach to the public. And I said, what if we start having some talks, about just general interest subjects, not on a Sunday, just in the evening, completely non-threatening way for people to invite their friends to come check it out. And like, oh, great, you're in charge. And of course, I knew that would happen. I mean, I'm not stupid. I know that if you're going to make a suggestion, you're volunteering yourself. So I said, well, suffering's a pretty good subject. It's something that everyone has to deal with. It's not a uniquely Christian issue. It's the kind of thing you could just say to your friend. And I'm attending a talk about why people suffer. You want to come along? That kind of thing. So I put it together for my church. I went ahead and had the presentation there. It went really well. I'd never done any public speaking, never done any recorded speaking, never done any speaking really, maybe like a little bit in college for an assignment or something, but that's about it. But everyone seemed to really like it. They said that it was that it made a lot of sense, that I really explained things well. And I was talking to you and you're like, you should put that up on YouTube. And I was like, I guess I could do that. I learned quickly that making in my case, a 50-minute video does not take 50 minutes. It doesn't take 3 hours. It just goes on and on and on. It probably took me 40 hours to put together the 50-minute video. But even though it was a major pain to do, and almost all that's editing, and even though it was a major pain to do all the editing, to get rid of all those little clicks in the background and and so on, get rid of all the parts where I forgot what I wanted to say and paused for 10 seconds and stuff like that. Just the idea of making videos was pretty exciting. So I've now written the script for the second video. It's going to be much shorter. I do think that 50 minutes is really long to ask people to watch that much content. I personally like to listen to things that are about 10 or 15 minutes long. I feel like that way you get a good in-depth understanding of something. but it's not so long that you feel like you're making a major commitment, that you have to wait till you have a bunch of free time or anything like that. So I'm going to probably try to make most of the videos in that range.
Yeah, and just for the record, some Muslims are going to want to know, are you being funded by the Jews?
No, sadly not.
Okay, well, sadly not. So what's the mood of your channel going to be? And what's the scope of it?
So I'm going to concentrate mostly on apologetic type issues, probably looking at various ways that people attack Christianity. Of course, the argument, the problem of evil that the first video is about is kind of the one thing that atheists will always say, well, this proves atheism is true. There's too much evil in the world. So I'm going to look more along those lines rather than a more polemic version, a more polemic site like yours. I definitely want to do some videos that are mostly about theology, not necessarily about apologetics. You know, akin to your Biblical Insights series.
Awesome. And you are, you mentioned theology, you are studying to be a theologian, is that correct?
Yes, I'm currently, I graduated college many years ago, but I went recently, decided to get a degree in theology with the aim of being a professor. So I'm about 2 years into the program. It's normally a 2 to 3 year program, but I'm attending very part-time. So it'll take me more like 4 or 5 years to complete.
There was a bit of an audio glitch. Did you say what kind of theology you were studying, or?
No, I didn't specify.
Okay.
Right now, it's just a general theology degree. It'll be a master's of theology.
Yeah. Are you more systematic, biblically oriented? What kind of theology do you find interesting?
So right now, my concentration is actually on church history. Just because I have some background in the historical arguments for Christianity, I thought that'd be a good place. And, you know, not many people really study the church fathers, so I thought that'd be a good area to get into. I haven't definitely decided that yet, though. I'm not far enough in that I've started on concentration courses, so I could change my mind. But right now, that's what I'm looking at is church history.
Yeah, we have this comment that you've come up with a really good response for in the chat from Yaya Joseph, who says, get ready for it, Islam is the fastest growing religion on the planet. What do you think about that?
Well, that's great, because my third video, which is just in the research stages right now, is going to be exactly on that comment. It's something, obviously, if you talk to any Muslims, that's like going to be like their second or third, or maybe their first line of defense. And well, one, it's a really dumb argument to make, because the number of people who believe something has no correlation to the truth of a matter. It's also really dumb because there's more Christians than Muslims. So if you're using numbers, then Christianity is apparently more true than Islam. But it's also really deceptive, because the only reason Islam has grown fast in the last 20 years is because of a high birth rate. But that's mostly because in the Christian nations, with the Industrial Revolution has fully taken hold and people are no longer having a large number of children. But that's now spreading to the rest of the world, and the birth rates in the Muslim countries are dropping. So they won't maintain that advantage very long. And what I found is that the number of people converting out of Islam is substantially more than the number converting in. And I think that at some point you're going to reach a critical mass of the number of ex-Muslims. This is pretty much the first time in history that it's been possible to challenge Islam. One, the translation of the sources into English, as you said, but also the internet. I mean, when you live in a country that's 99% Muslim and the borders are closed, you're probably not going to ever be exposed to anyone who thinks differently, and you're going to have no reason to doubt it. But that's no longer true with the internet bringing down the borders.
Yeah, that's true. I've heard on Christian Prince, for example, people call in, and one specifically within the last couple of weeks said just that. I never questioned Islam until the internet. He was 25 or so, and so he had grown up as the internet was gaining popularity. And I've heard others call in saying something as well, like, I started questioning Islam when I started watching David Wood. I had a channel or a comment on my channel the other day that said something like, I haven't started or I haven't questioned Islam, but I'm starting to now. Thank you. And you know that someone who begins to question Islam, it won't be very long at all before they are officially an apostate. So the internet definitely has a huge role to play for sure.
It looks like Sayed is saying your churches are empty except for some old people. Christianity's dying out. It's a really ironic comment because, well, one, Christianity is growing. It is growing about 1.4% a year. Islam's growing about 1.7% a year. It's not a massive difference to begin with. And yes, the birth rate's really low in Europe. People have left the church in Europe. People have left the church in America, but and atheists like to make this argument that, people are leaving the church. Everyone's going to be an atheist in 20 years. But then you look at the actual numbers and it's, the number of percent who identify as Christian has dropped from 89 to 85 in the United States over the last 30 years. And it's like, well, if that trend continued forever and ever and ever, yeah, maybe. But then you look at Africa, there was approximately zero Christians in Africa. I mean, not literally zero, but less than 1% Christians in Africa in 1900. And now it's, 40% Christian. You look at China, there was 0% Christian. Then it was almost 100% atheist or agnostic because of the communist revolution. When they moved out, religion's moving back in. So people can become atheists and then not be atheists anymore. And just looking at the United States, say 30% of people, well, less than 30, sorry. Say 15% of people raised as Christians stop being Christians when they're adults. Well, if you look at the numbers of atheism, it's really pretty similar. That the number of, say, 15% of atheists raised as atheists have become religious during their lifetimes. So at some point, an equilibrium will be reached, and there'll be whatever percent of the population is Christian, whatever percent is not, and it won't really change. I don't envision any period in history where there will ever be a society that's mostly atheist. The number of atheists as a percentage has actually dropped steadily since 1970 worldwide. So, and then you look at like Islam, as of like, say, 1950, there was approximately 0 apostates in the world. And this is just getting started for Islam. Part of the reason that Christianity fell dramatically in the 1900s was because of the criticism coming out of first the German schools and then later spread around the world. And the church wasn't prepared to respond to this. Now the church has developed good responses to this sort of criticism. And, people are still exposed to this criticism on the internet. People still leave because of it. But this sort of thing has never been done for Islam before. It's just now starting to be done in the academic arena. I bet it will filter down a lot faster than it did for Christianity, but it will take a long time to filter down to the popular level. And knowing the Christian responses, I cannot see any legitimate responses that Muslims will be able to offer for that kind of criticism. And I think it will have a devastating effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And that German criticism that you mentioned, I mean, we interfaced a lot with this history of religions type criticism in the videos on the Gospels. And just it had to have seemed devastating for the people back in the 19th century, the early 20th century, with the dating of John's Gospel and so forth. But now these objections are simplistic. They're foolish. And it's hard to believe that they were ever proposed by such serious scholars. So yeah, we've absolutely learned to deal with this new genre of criticism for sure. and not having any problem doing so. Yeah, I would also ask, when Syed says your church is empty, I would ask when the last time he was in a church, so that he would know if it's empty or not. Syed, by the way, I'm not going to back you into a corner or anything, sir. If you would like to come on and just do a brief, meet and greet, then please do. Just trying to get some good dialogue going in the comments. Here we go. Yahya, the Quran has been preserved as God has promised. The Quran has been preserved as God has promised in the Quran. That's very interesting. Where is this preserved Quran? In the video on Abraham, I'm going to talk a little bit about how, in response to tracing some of the things in the Quran back to Jewish sources, Muslims will argue that the Quran, of course, they will assume that the Quran was edited, produced, etc., in the 7th century, but that's an assumption, because these preserved Quranic manuscripts that go back to Uthman do not exist. That was one great weakness that was cited by Dr. Ihsanullah Natakulich in their published work. There was an individual named Professor Dr. Muhammad Hamidullah who published on the locations of all these Quranic manuscripts. And then Dr. Ihsanullah Natakulich went around to find these manuscripts, and they weren't there. And the ones that were there in some sort of a form that were not as described. They were drastically incomplete, underrepresented, or whatever the case would be. So where are these perfectly preserved Quranic manuscripts? Someone also mentioned text criticism will be a significant objection for Muslims, and I agree it will be for ones who are very seriously minded. However, some Muslims have already started to shift to the argument from memory. That is, the manuscripts don't matter. It's been perfectly preserved in memory, which is, of course, circular. Where has it been perfectly preserved? And if it has been perfectly preserved, why are there so many manuscripts that differ? And why are there differing Arabic Qurans? So, yes, we will see how the Quran withstands Western criticism in the genre of textual criticism in the coming years. By the way, Quran Gateway is supposed to be released in September, October, late 2019 timeframe. So look forward to that. I'll be looking forward to producing a video showing you guys around the Quran Gateway, and we'll look at about 3,000 textual variants in these perfectly preserved Quranic manuscripts. Have you interfaced with any Muslims, at least in the comments section, Reason, who have interfaced with any of this material?
Yeah, most Muslims will just deny it. They say, "Oh, there's no textual variants," and then they'll be like, "Even Bart Ehrman agrees." Like, Bart Ehrman doesn't know crap about the Quran. I mean, that's the reality. He's never looked at a Quranic manuscript in his life. How would he know if there's any variants in it?
He actually says that in a video. I don't know anything about the Quran. Yeah, and he's not going to study the Quran because he fears for his life. Saeed says, if you wish to bring me on, and then he gives his username, definitely send that to me in an email. I can't bring you on now because of time constraints. I have to get to Bible study, and it would certainly strain my knowledge of digital technology to bring an additional person into this discussion. But Syed, yeah, definitely like to talk to you at a later time for sure. Let's get back to your video. You mentioned education, pursuing a master's in theology. How are you going to manage the time? Because you got into this with your video on suffering, realized that producing videos from YouTube is a form of suffering and extremely time consuming. Time management's difficult. What kind of output are you aiming for? We're talking about a video a week, every 2 weeks, something like that.
I'm going to aim for 1 a week. I don't know if I'll be able to sustain that. The next one will be the first time I edited one shorter than 50 minutes. So hopefully I'll get a better idea of how much time is involved. Pretty much all I do is I have a full-time job. I work my full-time job, and then I come home, have dinner with the family, and then probably 5 nights out of the week, I spend most of the rest of the night interfacing with Christianity in some aspect, either doing my course studies or just doing personal study, attending Bible study, or talking to people on YouTube comments. So I don't know. I don't know how it will work out. I'll just have to wait and see. I definitely want to continue putting them together, but I can't promise 1 a week.
Yeah, one a week is it's difficult to manage. I know for me personally, I'm similar to you. I have a job that's definitely not related to Islamic polemics for sure, and so everything I do here is completely in addition to everything else that's going on. So lots happening, a very full schedule for sure. Who is your channel going to be geared towards, especially your biblical content? Are you targeting non-specialists? Are you targeting people who are, within sort of the frame of serious Bible study, or just the casual viewers, or where are you going to set your target?
I think I'll try to have a mix, but I'm definitely going to be aiming for the more intellectual crowd, because that's my own interest. I want to get into deep studies, and if I never gain a large following, no big deal. I'm not really producing it to gain a following, so I don't really care. So yeah, I'm going to definitely try to aim for more intellectual level of discussion. I will have some videos like the fastest growing religion video that will be aimed for popular level. But for the most part, they'll be on the more intellectual side.
Yeah. I find though, as you challenge people, they respond. I mean, there are people who like this in-depth stuff. I was trying to scroll to my some of my biblical insights videos lately. The priestly blessing. I mean, we go back and read B19 from online. 2,600 views on that video. I never would have thought that. And good retention rates and so forth. We talked about the Ketephenum scrolls. That was pretty detailed. And the ancient hymn in Amos, cool of the day at 1,700 views. And the ancient hymn in Amos, that was on another level. I remember texting you about that, saying, I'm not really sure if this is going to be appropriate or not. And you were, go for it. And people really enjoyed that. So it's difficult to tell, but I think, I learn best when I'm challenged. And I think a lot of people are like that. And we need to expose people to the depth of the Bible, and that's, of course, the intent of that series, and sounds like what you'll be doing on your channel as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even if people don't take in the arguments necessarily, just knowing that there's good intellectual arguments out there kind of can change the perspective. You get rid of the stereotype that Christians are just simple-minded people who just believe stuff they've been told.
Yeah, absolutely. L. Ron Hubbard says, do you think ISIS followed the Quran to the core? And we definitely find explicit quotations echoed in ISIS literature related to the Hadith and to the Quran. Do they follow it to the core? I guess it depends on how you define that, but they certainly took some of their inspiration from those texts for sure. And I think it was, I think it's Christian Prince who has said before, show me one thing that ISIS did that Muhammad didn't. And that's a serious challenge indeed. So you mentioned your second video. I guess this will be your second video, right? Will you mirror this on your channel?
Oh, yeah, I guess so.
Okay, cool. So will you be producing some content on the Gospels? Because you've done a lot of writing on that, and you were kind enough to review my videos on the Gospels. I wanted to make sure they flowed well, and it's great to have someone review your work. And now it looks like that's coming back to get me, because you're asking me to review a video on Genesis 1:2. So now we get to quid pro quo a little bit. But I'm looking forward to any gospel content that you have coming up.
Yeah, well, real quickly first, my second video is going to be looking at Genesis 1:2, as you said. There's at least a scholarly debate over whether the text should be translated a wind from God or the Spirit of God, or some people even just say it should be a mighty wind. So I'm going to be taking a look at that, the whole verse, but basically focusing on whether or not you can see the Spirit in Genesis 1:2. I have set the topic for my next discussion at my church. I gave out a survey. The most popular request for the next lecture is how to deal with contradictions. So that would definitely be more or less focused on the Gospels. I'll probably make it a version for that for YouTube eventually. I won't be giving the talk until May, so it would be after May for sure. But yeah, I would definitely like to do some videos on the Gospels. I've spent a lot of time reading about the Gospels, a subject that may not be of much interest to most people, but one that I spent got into a lot was how you date them. That is, how do you determine when they are written? I don't want you to think how you take them out to the restaurant by date. I say that because I asked for a book for Christmas a couple of years ago that was called Dating the Old Testament or something along those lines, and my sister was like, what in the world is this about? Because she was thinking, go on a date with. I was like, no, that's not what it's about. It's not about how to it's not about the Bible's teaching on courtship. But
well, that was reflected in a comment as well on one of the videos for the gospel series. Someone, and I think it was that agnostic guy who he's I don't know if he's agnostic, but he says he's not religious, but he enjoys the biblical content on the channel, which is great. I think it was him who said, it sounds like this is a dating game, just making a joke. So yeah, you're not the only one.
Yeah, so that's one area that I personally would like to write about. I would like to look at the historical evidence for the gospel authorship. I know you got into that a little bit with your videos. That's another area I've looked at a lot, and then just generally how we can tell that they're reliable history. There's definitely a lot to say about that. Obviously all of these subjects would be too much for one video if I covered them all. So I just pick a small little thing, pick one passage where you can trace something to other non-biblical historical sources and show that they agree, that kind of thing.
What do you think of Mike Licona's work? You mentioned contradictions, and I really like some of the work that he's done on that, showing these. They are things that we would consider contradictions, but they weren't contradictions for the writers of antiquity. Have you read much into what he has to say?
I haven't read a lot of his works, but I'm familiar with what you're referring to. Just the general idea. I don't know what he specifically has written necessarily, but yeah, I mean, when you look at things in the original context, it's totally different than the way we read it. For example, in Acts, Stephen gives this speech about tracing through the Old Testament history, and he just like randomly skips ahead, and he doesn't make it clear that he's talking about a different person. And sometimes people raise as an objection, see, the New Testament can't even get the Old Testament right. I'm like, no, that was perfectly ordinary way to analyze the texts at the time. And then the same kind of pattern plays out in secular history, where people didn't expect things to be written in chronological order necessarily. For example, they expected it to be thematic and go along in a subject. And you could say, and this happened, even if it didn't necessarily happen afterwards, chronologically speaking. So if you look at it the way the original audience would have understood it, there's a big difference in how you would read it. And of course, a historian knows these things, and they look at a secular history and they see that kind of thing, and they don't think it's a problem. They don't say, oh, that means this is false and made up and anything like that. But then people who don't know anything about history, don't really know anything about the Bible, they just read some website, got an argument off in like, oh, see, this proves it's wrong. He put the cities out of order. And it's like, really? That's what you're going by? The two cities were in the wrong order, arguably?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that Licona points out is that you have examples of this in other contemporary literature. So Luke, for example, on the same day in the last chapter of his gospel. Then when you get to Acts, it's a 40-day period, from Jesus' resurrection to the ascension. So which is it? And then he points to Lucian, who talks about stitching the narratives together inextricably, so that you go from one event to the other to the other. That's how you write good history. And so that's what Luke adopted in his gospel, but he didn't in Acts because he's doing something different. And so these are not the ways we would write history. We wouldn't treat chronology like the ancient writers did. When you get to the Old Testament, then you have this concept of theologized history. that they are very interested in telling the interpretation of history as it existed in their theological worldview. And so none of this stuff makes any sense to modern readers. And so if they're not careful, they certainly see contradictions where there are none. But what we're proposing, and I'll get into this a little bit with the 1 Samuel 15 video, is actually something very, very simple. And that is, guess what? Ancient writers wrote differently than we do. They use different methods. They use different motifs. So you have to understand that when you read it. And it's a very fascinating topic to see exactly how they did this. But I think that this has a lot of explanatory power with respect to the contradictions that we see. They're simply writers using methods that we're not familiar with. And 2,000 years from now, maybe historians, if this world is still around, will look back at the way we write history and say, look at those idiots. What were they thinking?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong or there's nothing inherently more right with saying that a history should be in chronological order. I mean, that's just our perspective, and we impose our perspective on people who had different perspectives. And that's not really a reasonable thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of studying the Bible, I have to go to Bible study. So sounds like lots of good stuff coming from your channel. Certainly encourage people to subscribe. You might get a couple of Muslim keyboard jihadis on your channel as a result of this if you haven't already. So welcome them. You're well acquainted with them. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what you have coming up, and hope you're still able to spend some time on the comment section of my channel as well. And I'll certainly try to reciprocate that.
Definitely. And, if you'd like to have another discussion sometime, taking audience questions or whatever, I'd be happy to be on.
Sounds good. Thanks so much. And thanks to everyone in the live chat as well who participated. God bless you and your ministry, sir, and God bless the audience. And I will see you back here with a video on Abraham and the furnace before too long. Take care, everybody.